Thank you, Sangamitra. And now we'll take some questions. So we'll take a few questions and then we'll give it to you to answer. And then as we have, depending on how much time we have, we'll take a few more subsequent rounds of questions. So yeah, Manish.
So I want to take off from the last, the point you said, the point you made about mindsets at the end.
Just introduce yourself because we know you, but
yeah, my name is Manish. I'm with CPR. So just to illustrate the centrality of caste to the question, to addressing this question of manual scavenging, which is visible in the paradox of that young gentleman whose story you illustrated, right? Where on the one hand, this focus on liberating people from manual scavenging or rehabilitating them is not accompanied by a simultaneous thrust on creating opportunities elsewhere, right? So if a Dalit man who is the son of a manual scavenger, despite his education, is only able to get him a job that pays 1/4 of his scavenging work, I think that's very indicative of what the problem is, right? My specific question is on safety measures and the equipment that you spoke about. Did you, in your interaction, find that the problems that were being articulated by the workers with regard to the safety equipment were being taken into consideration as feedback or otherwise by the people who are designing this equipment? Who designs this? Eh? Women have been have been engaged in sanitation work for a long time in India. They have been wearing saris and doing it for a long time. So who are these designers who are making these boots that don't work with saris, for example, and similarly with other kinds of safety equipment and other such?
Are there any other questions? So yes, the girl at the back, then you, sir, and then Nimi. Yeah. No, you come up to the mic and also just introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, I'm Neil from a firm called Dalberg. Thank you for your presentation. Just one point I wanted to ask was around. Sorry. So around the secondary occupation where people are also involved in like cleaning of dishes or washing of utensils, one point is who exactly are these workers among the sanitation workers? Are these women who are sweeping or who are these workers who are doing these secondary jobs? Secondly, are the employers aware of the fact they're doing this job? So is that sort of recognition, yes, they're doing this job? And thirdly, I don't know if you probed on that, but given that they're earning, I think, around 15,000, and I think their other wages might be 7,000. Have they ever thought of leaving and just getting more of that secondary occupation?
Yes, sir.
I'm Sagar. I run company and I do some writing work also. You have spoken on a subject as far as the Safai Karamcharis are state of affairs. But the state of affair appears to be in both the municipality because they are mechanized, they are using lot of machinery, and because both are a smart city, so they are using very heavy equipment. And as you must have seen that we are using, cleaners at home, vacuum cleaners. Then there are a lot of equipments. Actually, the skill training to the workers are not being done. We have to stress on that point because they being coming from the poorest of the poor. So there are lot of tools, and anybody without the tool is not supposed to work. That is the first-hand information to be provided to all the technicians and the engineers. But they are not following those routes, and that is the root cause of the deaths which are taking place. And for every scavenging part, there is a tool and there is an equipment to which you have not elaborated in any of your presentation. Thank you.
Nimi? Yeah. So I'll just go this way and then, just go around the room like that. Yeah.
So, Nimi Kurian, Center for Policy Research. So when we look at the location of the social groups that you mentioned, both physical as well as social, I think the evidence seems to suggest that there is this nexus between a sort of marginalization and a sort of their occupation. That's the sort of, or let's say there's this link, that the nexus between waste and marginalization, and which is also in a sense ironical, because when you look, when you suggested that how much of an emphasis there is on cleanliness, and cleanliness becomes in a sense a marker of urban modernity, but at the same time your association with garbage then identifies you as an outsider. So when you look at this, I was wondering if you came across in your fieldwork or in your literature survey examples from India or elsewhere where there is an exercise of collective action to break the nexus between waste and marginalization. Because the only example that I can think of which broke this nexus rather remarkably is the landfill protests in Mexico, where Mexico's urban marginalized sanitation workers went on to very effectively block the metropolitan area's access to the garbage dump, and as a result of which you have garbage piling up, and which brought the local officials down to their knees to and forced them to negotiate with the sanitation workers. So there's this very interesting example of very effective collective action, which I don't see reflected in your talk, because you did seem to suggest that even whenever they tried, there was the stigma, and there was this, they came up against all sorts of issues, which is a point well taken, but it seems to inadvertently, perhaps you don't of course imply it, but inadvertently it seems to kind of force them into this freeze frame where they can't escape for all sorts of reasons. You mentioned mentioned about the role of the state, the role of society, people like us, but I think where you need to really shine a light on is the role of agency by these people as collective actors. Thank you.
So just go in another round. So Sangamitra, I'll request you to be a bit brief because there are many questions, and I have a question, but many other people do as well.
Thank you very much for all these questions. I'll probably try to go in order and explain some of them maybe together. As regards Manish's query, it's very important that design does matter in terms of the use of a particular equipment, and coming from the narratives of the very personnel of the urban local bodies, in both the cities, the information suggests that what was the deciding factor was basically the meetings between the officials, meetings with the officials outside the country in terms of deciding what kind of equipment, which equipment, what will be the size of the equipment. So be it the gumboots or the bunny suits, they are very, very ill-fitting. They continue to be ill-fitting despite the fact that the feedbacks from the workers have been reiterated over and over again about the ill-fitted gadgets. And in this very realm, let me come to you, Minnie, that there have been the people, workers, collectives, formal as well as informal, who have become the agency of informing the so-called officials about the uselessness, if I can use that word, of these gadgets. So there has been that dialogue which is on, and yes, like I said, this is work in progress. I have not been able to put in right here over there. Neha asked about the workers and their choices of secondary occupation. This is very, very symbolic of women alone, largely women who have. This particular data is of the women workers who have reported that they did have any kind of secondary occupation that they went in for. Yes, they were asked about their social background, and a good number of them, more than 60%, did not tell them about their social background, and therefore they are traveling something to the tune of 7 to 8 kilometers, 7 to 10 kilometers on an average to be able to work in those places where they are working. That itself is therefore telling us about what they. And yes, there are a couple of narratives which suggest that they have given up the jobs also, because 4 o'clock in the morning versus 10 o'clock in the morning to go and do a domestic kind of work. There are references. Training, yes, is a very important component, Dr. Sagar. Yes, I have not really dwelled on the training part of it, but the point I'm raising vis-a-vis training is that on the one hand, when the ULBs take cognizance of the mechanization, machines have been brought, machines are reportedly lying unused because there are no trained workers. Workers are refraining and showing some kind of resentment also because this work is not listed as kind of skilled work, and therefore they refrain, there's some kind of resentment in undergoing training. Two, the trainings are not really being, if they're training being put in, the responses are lukewarm, and I'm yet to get into the data to explore further into it. But yes, it is important, and certainly I will take note of this. Many, like I said, there are collectives for sure, and both formal and informal. And if I can draw some parallels, Ahmedabad shows me a larger context of some kind of organized collectives as compared to Delhi. That could also be the bias of the sample bias, which could be reflecting, but I get more nuanced, organized collectives in Ahmedabad as compared to Delhi, which is one reason where they are coming up together is equipments as per se. So for sure, it is not, I'm not trying to convey the helplessness in any sense, but I'm trying to make the point, yes, these are the issues wherein there is a connect for sure. Rack pickers, for example, and especially if you relate with the landfill, they become extremely relevant. I have not really got into the rack pickers part of it. Gangtok is another city where I have some narratives from. Right next to Teesta, you have that dumping ground. What do you do about it? So that is something, I think I'll stop.
Yeah. So Dipinder, Shimona, and then you guys, both of you.
Yeah, I think Delhi and Ahmedabad you've cited specifically in your study. So what I wanted to say was perhaps I don't know in great detail about manual scavenging within Delhi and Ahmedabad. But my experience from NIUA, from working in other cities, is that this whole issue of technology and training actually doesn't apply. Because you have to see the kind of toilets there are,
sure,
the kind of septic tanks. Somebody has to get in. So I think it's a very easy thing to say you train them, you bring right gum boots, you bring some right technology, it will solve the problem. It won't solve the problem. As long as the kind of toilets there are, somebody has to get in.
Sure.
And it's not just toilets in India, even in UK, somebody has to get in. So that is unavoidable. So I don't think we should get into that purist approach that, somebody will not. Here it's a caste and Dalit issue. There it is not. But yes, no amount of technology and training can at least, solve this problem. And one other thing which you could highlight is the kind of neoliberal solutions which are being offered through training, through, like there's one very cited example of in Hyderabad. The manual scavengers have been told to buy trucks and machines which cost 26 lakhs each. So that is also something which can be highlighted.
Shimona?
I don't really have a question. Mine is more of a comment. What I thought was important to sort of there's a distinction which we must be alive to between two categories of work which are now, currently being discussed
under the sort of broad framework of sanitation workers or safai karamcharis. One is the kind of work that is, the general sanitation kind of work which you talked about, which is cleaning the streets and collecting garbage and all, which is, of course, could do with some amount of checks and balances in terms of ensuring health, safety, etc. And the other kind of work which is actually prohibited by the Constitution itself under Article 17, which is work that reinforces and arises out of practices of untouchability. And I think that is very important to segregate these two kinds of work and examine them separately, because manual scavenging, when it involves manually collecting human excreta or entering into manholes to clean human excreta or sewage, results in pollution which is not just about the physical pollution, but it's leads to practices of untouchability and social exclusion which don't extend only to that one specific person, but to that entire family and also to generations to come, whether they've ever touched human fecal matter or not. The reason why I'm saying that this is important is because I'm seeing this kind of, I think, and in fact in your thing you did point out how the transition from the 93 law to the 2013 law, this distinction has collapsed. And when the 93 law, there was an absolute prohibition, and anybody found, it's a different matter that nobody was prosecuted under that act, but if anybody was found employing a manual scavenger, it was a crime. Now under the 2013 act, if you're wearing protective gear and you this and that and all these exemptions and exceptions, and that kind of collapses the whole situation. And as someone who has appeared regularly in court, trying to actually get courts to pass orders, and I've kind of handled the Safai Karamchari Andolan case in the Supreme Court and the Delhi High Court for almost 8 years, if not more. The thing that happens is that the judges will say, but then who will clean it? What will happen to our toilets? What will happen to our sewers? So, I mean, at the point is the Constitution had a sort of a logic, and that's where the law comes from, that untouchability is prohibited. And if these practices are resulting in untouchability, and the fact, as you also again pointed out, that the people who are doing the manual scavenging, as in the contact with the human excreta kind of work, they forget about being able to ever do cooking. Even the rehabilitation happens in other sanitation work. So for instance, just to give you a small example, when we were handling the matter relating to the Indian Railways in the Delhi High Court, and they came up with this very advanced technology relating to bio toilets, where all the human fecal matter would sort of disappear into thin air. Of course, it doesn't disappear into thin air, but eventually the resulting what do you call it, waste matter, it is the manual scavengers who will clean that bio toilet which has been developed by the DRDO. So I think that really important to segregate that the work that is prohibited and the reason why it's prohibited, and the work that requires this sort of protective gear. I'm actually very troubled by the fact that the 2013 Act just collapses everything.
Isha.
Hi, I'm Isha from the Center for Policy Research. So my first question is somewhat more of a clarification, wherein you said that the two reasons why they get into manual scavenging work, one is they do not have adequate education, and the second is the benefit of housing from the municipal bodies. So I mean, I suppose the second one is more for the permanent workers, and so I was interested in how much of a subset of your sample is this actually applicable for, because it may be a really small part of the sample, and how does the story differ in case of the more contractual and more precarious staff. Secondly, I was interested in the question of the othering of these individuals. So I was wondering if you could comment a bit more on that, if there are narratives wherein people have attempted to make a break and go into other kinds of, wage employment, what are the entry barriers they would have faced? Is othering the only thing, or are there,
Other barriers too.
Hi, I'm Nirat from Dalberg. I've got a couple of questions. First of all, wonderful study. I think there's a lot of rich insight in those interviews, so would love to sort of dig a little deeper. A couple of questions. The first one being, if you look at this historically, and we assume that it is anchored in caste, and then that sets some sort of a suboptimal equilibrium, right, where you have these people from a caste and they get employment, and by and large the system is in steady state, right? Now what's happened in India over the last 4 or 5 years because of Swachh Bharat Mission, etc., in urban and rural, you actually have a discontinuity. So you have the growth rate in sanitation systems has been much more than one would imagine population growth rate in those caste communities, right? So what do you see that sort of panning out, where other people from outside this caste are coming in because there's some sort of an employment opportunity, or are you seeing more people in a household actually going here? So and just the nuances of how they think about this decision-making process would be very useful. That's the first question. The second question is really about the meaningful differences that you found in Ahmedabad versus Delhi, right? There are a couple of charts which show some differences in how you find secondary work, but what are substantive differences that you found, both from a problem lens and also, more importantly, perhaps from solution lens, right? Anything that you think Ahmedabad or Delhi is doing better, which could then be the seed for scaling this across cities.
We have one more question from the gentleman, and then I'll give it back to you.
Sure.
My question is on the Swachh Bharat campaign. Do you think that will actually help the condition of these workers or harm them? And because it seems to be that very assumption underlying that the country is not Swachh. It seems to be that it has this problem of this open reputation problem. Why is it there's stress elsewhere? Perhaps it's the lack of a Swachh Prashashan that the country is so wretched. Why isn't there a, emphasis on some other aspects of the administration? Is there such bias being built into what's really comfortable?
Okay, it's all yours.
Okay. Thanks to each one of you for posing this question, because to me, the questions which are going to make my study a little more robust. Starting with what Dipender pointed out in terms of technology and training, I absolutely agree with you that technology and training takes a back seat when it comes to these structures that we see in our cities and the toilets, the kind of toilets which are used. But when you say that at some given time point, human being has to do that, there is a need for the human contact for this kind of a job. My only plea is that when we contrast these with the likes of United Kingdoms or USA or Shanghai, we see that the sewer lines of those countries are so very well lit that I can go and have a picnic over there. But contrast that with ours. After all, we are talking about human beings on both ends of the globe. So why is it, therefore, if we can think and contemplate Chandrayaan, why can't we do this as well? I'm not too sure economics will come to explain this, but my only plea is that, therefore, do we not need to consider this? If we acknowledge that at some given time point, a human contact is inevitable, then that kind of contact has to be made as comfortable as possible. That's the point I would want to make, and I absolutely agree that perhaps yes, there is a point where human contact may be necessary, at least the kind of structures, that physical structures that we have in the name of the cities and the toilets within these cities. Shumana, really a great point that you've made in terms of this disaggregation. I would have really wanted to dwell on that. The way we transit from, I will take ourselves back to 61, when it is actually pointed out by the Malkhani Committee report that these are the people who get engaged in a particular act, and a social identity is one of the very important factors. So I think it is very, very relevant to us to be able to understand this distinction. And when I am taking note of this distinction, a lot of sanitation or the workers who are engaging in cleaning jobs continue to come from a very specific community. And from that point of view, I would still want to say, even if it is the surface cleaning in which the individual could be engaging, the social identity is kind of getting superimposed to allow that practice of untouchability. And it, of course, gets aggravated when the work is that of cleaning the human excreta or the sewer. For sure, that is. So there is no attempt whatsoever to suggest that the two are similar, yet there is some kind of consonance if the social identities take a form instead of the work per se. So that on that count, I am in consonance with you when it comes to this kind of disaggregation. Also because to some kind of, if I can say that 2013 actually seems to have betrayed what was there in 1993. So yes, I am with you on that count. Isha, yes, a very, very well taken point that you've reflected. Uh, being inadequately, if I can use that word, educated, or perhaps not having the propensity to get yourself self-employed, perhaps also is embedded in the fact that I'm talking in terms of historical deprivation. And historical deprivation which continues to get reflected on any kind of human development indicator that you look across the social groups of the country. So that is what I would want to perhaps say in this context, and the kinds of barriers which therefore get generated. Let me just share some of the instances which come up through in both the cities particularly, where both women and men, especially the younger ones, who have kind of shown strong resentment in continuing with the so-called customary rights to continue with the job, they have opened shop. One that, as per the commission's provisions, what you can get some kind of allowance in opening a particular shop is something like a 40,000 rupees to start on with, and of that kind of sum, you're encouraged to start a pan shop or a gumti to be able to sell bhuttas and things like that. So the mindset which I have for the other who's working in is that as a sanitation worker, if the alternative is to be sought, is in a particular kind of a bracket. Why can't the bracket expand itself to think in terms of the engineer, the sewer line engineers, rather than the sewer line, guys who could continue to do the cleaning. So that kind of reference is there. And I would probably want to bring in what yet another study done by somebody from the university, Tata Institute, Asim Prakash, I'm sure some of us might be familiar with this work, wherein alternative, employments in terms of open, getting into selling certain items were taken on by the others in the right perspective till the social identities of these erstwhile workers were identified. The study is across, I think, 4 or 5 states of the country. So there are attempts which suggest that efforts are being made for alternative occupations, but there are references such as these, there are reactions such as these, wherein, to my mind, I would want to say that the other component also has to be equally responsive about this kind of assimilation. Yes, I would really agree when you say that there has been some kind of equilibrium, and the moment equilibrium gets disturbed, there are very, very obvious kind of reactions such as this. The point perhaps I would want to make at this level is there have been, like you said, the surge in occupation vis-a-vis post Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and in that surge, we all know that the contractual worker has increased. And in that contractual worker, yes, there are, in fact, the study sample also has about 12 of them were non-Dalits. But the narratives from these non-Dalits are amazing. In fact, two of them are sewer cleaners also. These kind of, and I'm not generalizing, I'm relying on these 12 of them, have actually subcontracted their work. On the roll, it is these individuals, and they're very happy to talk about it. I thought there'll be some kind of apprehension to share their ideas, but they're quite all right with the fact that they have somebody else who's going to do that work. So they have to only come and sign the roll and get their, So when I want to look at the data of enrollment, which I'm still, I don't really have the real quantum of that data, but then there has been a search, and of course a lot of it is related to the fact, the kind of thrust which has been given to the Abhiyan per se. And in this light, I'm sure some of us will recall when Delhi Municipal Corporation of Delhi had advertised sometime last year, and there was a visually challenged individual who was kept for the sewer cleaning. Now, I don't see, with all due respect to our arguments for, differently abled people, how do we connect a kind of employment which is being offered to an individual such as, work such as this to an individual? No, I may have my narrow vision, but I would really want to learn about this kind of connect. How do we see this kind of, connect which we are drawing in terms of a visually, a challenged person kind of putting in over there. So that's something which I just wanted to table it vis-a-vis the kind of, surge which is happening in terms of vis-a-vis the Abhiyan or whichever way we want to describe it. Okay. And I certainly don't think the Abhiyan is an answer to any such issue, because until and unless we consider this work with dignity and the individuals are human beings, no Abhiyan will make any kind of difference. I am more than sure of that, and I'm extremely sorry for overshooting the time.
It's fine. So we're completely out of time. So what I'm thinking is that many people are going to still have questions, and it's a complicated topic, and there's a lot to say. So I think the conversation with Sangamitra can continue. Whoever's still got things to say, but I think we'll close it officially, because a lot of people may have to leave and may have travel home and things like that. So yeah, but I'm sorry, yours is the one question that has got left. So please, you can ask now.
Okay, I was given
So my question is on the Swachh Bharat mission. I'm Kaushalya. I come from a policy research organization called PROACT. So the SPM guidelines basically suggest twin pit latrines. Now, twin pit latrines decompose human excreta, and decomposed human excreta is not covered by the Prohibition and Rehabilitation of Manual Scavengers Act of 2013. So, in other words, it's institutionalizing this job of manual scavenging, but it's not manual scavenging anymore because it's decomposed. Now, and I've tabulated from both the Swachh Bharat Mission, Grameen and urban websites, a total of 5 crore toilets have been built. So who's going to clean these toilets? Are we going to have more manual scavengers? And that's something that's worrying me. I would really want your guidance to...
Out of these 500 crores which have been built, the NSSO data says that only 43 odd percent are in use. Yeah? That's one. The other is...
So that's a good thing.
Okay, we can imagine what actually will be happening to this kind of a scenario. And you're absolutely right. The nature of the matter has been changed. So you can't call it manual scavenging. So you're out of that gamut of any kind of penalty which you get. Yes. Yeah. So Abhiyan or no Abhiyan, things will not change if we don't look at the dignity and the human rights, human identity kind of a thing. So that's
okay. Thank you so much.
Yes, I think just we can continue the conversation and
yeah, sure, it's all right. Thank you very much for listening to me.